No, we're not restarting the loop. Hi, welcome everyone. So this is the August edition of the Micro Frontend Meetup. I hope you're all doing well. Topic for today will be a look at Module Federation, Native Federation, and Piral, when to use what. We will develop an example micro frontend and an example application using each of these three technologies, and we just compare them. But before we get started, we have, of course, as usual, a couple of organizational things we need to go over. So first of all, this session is being recorded and being made available on YouTube. So even after the recording, after the live stream, the recording will be available in form of a URL. Therefore, anything that you write to the chat will be also be made available. Therefore, please always think about it. And speaking of activity in the chat room, of course, as usual, activity in the chat is appreciated. Ask your questions and, of course, place your comments as you find them appropriate. But always, of course, be gentle and polite. We have a code of conduct that you should, of course, follow. So far, we didn't have any problems. But just to point that out. All right, if you have a good story to tell, if you have something in the space of micro frontends that you want to discuss, that you want to show, then please, of course, get in touch. There are multiple ways to do so. So, of course, what you could do, for instance, is that you just write me, for instance, on LinkedIn. That's always a possibility. You can also go to our Discord channel and either contact me on Discord or write it in the Discord channel. And finally, what would be even the best way to do is that you just submit it as a proposal via the call for papers on Sessionize. So there we have a dedicated space called sessionize.com/microfrontends-meetup. If you have any story to tell, then please submit it there, and then we'll have you in the show very soon. Now, some advertisement. We will have in this year one final workshop, public workshop coming up. So if you're interested in essentials for module federations or something that we will touch in a second as well, but just, of course, on let's say, the outer shell, then you can, of course, go to workshops.microfrontends Cloud, and you will see all the workshops that we are offering in general. And of course, as mentioned, there's still, I think, in the beginning of September, one more workshop about module federation essentials. But have a look what's there, and maybe you'll find something that's interesting to you. All right, and that's all the bureaucratic stuff I have for you. So now we can already dive into the topic for today. And for this, I prepared a little bit of, let's say, of an example structure. So we will go into three things. So we will go into module federation, native federation, Piral, and essentially in that order. And what we will do is we will just look at an application, which is the Tractor Store version 1. So already prepared with a product page. And the, let's say, idea behind this is to just extend it now with a micro frontend, right? And what would be needed in order to go there? Plus, of course, when we choose a particular technology, let's say module federation, what are the advantages and disadvantages of choosing it? So I also just, to get something visual going on, crafted out two things. One is the actual application. So here in the app folder, in our template that we'll reuse for the three things. And as you can see, it's just a single page application. And give it a title, give it a div here where our application will render in there. And the rest is just a few source files. Don't worry if you don't like React. We are not really using React to say the React is the greatest. We are using this also to show something about dependency sharing. But the application here and all the essential fragments have been written using React. But if you don't like React, if you don't know React, then let's not care about it too much. So we will not really care about how this rendering works, etc. with React. That's rather standard if you're coming from React. We are more into how these components then work together. For instance, here we have the definition of this product page, which is again the main part of our application. And from this product page here, how then different fragments coming from the different micro frontends can be shown. By default now it is, or it will be, very empty, right? So just this plain tractor store in there, and then we will fill it with a little bit of life coming from different micro frontends. Now everything already regarding this application has been prepared. So if you care about this setup, it's the tractor store version 1 from Michael Gers. This is like a little bit of the to-do MVC of micro frontends, and we're using version 1 as it's much simpler than version 2, and just to get the points across. All right. Also, we have, of course, some assets here. So looking, for instance, at the implementation in Module Federation. So there's nothing in the MF space right now. So we just copied over the template. I prepared already a little bit here for the core application. So we prepared a couple of dependencies. Some of these we will only need later, like the Module Federation Enhanced. But what we already have right now in order to build using RSpec or RSbuild in this case is we need RSbuild core. And since we are using React, we also install the RSbuild plugin React plugin. And with these two, I mean, we're quite well equipped. Otherwise, there's not much to do here, right? We have our app.jsx pretty much unchanged at this point, and we just moved our index.html in here. Remove the script because that will be automatically inserted by Webpack, by RSpec. And the reason is, so we can ignore this for a moment, that we give it an HTML template in here, right? And this source index.html will just be copied over and then augmented with, for instance, the path to the script. So we can now, again, this is not having anything with Module Federation at this point in time. Go and try to start this application, and hopefully it will work. So this seems to be fine. Let me also open the browser. Go to localhost 1234, and we see nothing essentially. So let's see. Did we start it correctly? It seems to be working fine, but it's running at /app. So let's go there, and no, we're not getting it up. This is already a great start to the demo gods. But here we are. So I'm not sure why. I guess it's the trading slash. But so here we are, right? It's there, it's running. We can just navigate around. Everything seems to be working as it should. Fine. But there's nothing in here yet that, you know, communicates with micro frontends, brings in micro frontends. So the question at this point, of course, is how can we bring in micro frontends to this setup? Now, this is, of course, where some of the code that I just commented out comes in quite handy. What we can do is that we can get the Module Federation plugin that's written for RSpec, so the bundler underneath RSbuild. And once we have this, we can just use the tools section to actually change the setup of RSpec explicitly. So this configuration is used in RSbuild to say, hey, we now want to override the configuration that you hand over to RSpec. Therefore, we get the configuration that was originally supplied. And there are some convenience functions like append plugins. And what we do is that we just then override the output path things to give it a little bit of a better setup than it was beforehand. And finally, to append the Module Federation plugin that we obtained up here, right? So we can do that, and I guess we need to restart. Let's just see. It said it recompiled automatically, and yeah, it did fully restart, but now it fails. Why does it fail? Well, it's an old thing that in the future will, of course, be gone, so they're actively working on that. Since in this transition that we just did, we also want, of course, to optimize resources already. And for doing that, we declared one dependency in form of React already shared, meaning this thing, of course, will be now loaded and used already for everything that runs now in this application. But the micro frontends might also use it, so we want also to share it. But if we do so, then it must be asynchronous. And since it's asynchronous, right, it needs to load in the beginning. Now, the app.jsx, that's a direct entry point, so it's synchronous, but it needs to be asynchronous, and it can be changed really simple. We just cut that out, put it in an own module, like bootstrap.jsx, that's the same code. And then all we do is, in the synchronous module, we make an asynchronous import of this other module that we just created. And therefore, we have the synchronous entry point, but then we just lazy load, so to speak, the rest of it. Again, ideally, we wouldn't need that because it should detect that we actually use in the same module something that is loaded asynchronous, and it should do that out of the box. But yeah, we need to do that manually, that step. And here we go. I mean, ideally, it would even detect that this thing should be eagerly loaded in that scenario because, yeah, the only thing we start at this point in time is our application. So everything must be synchronous, so React should be just there, and then we provide it in a synchronous way, which is called eager loading in Webpack. Nevertheless, we did that, and the end result is that our application works again, right? It's functional, but still doesn't have any micro frontends in there. So that's how any kind of Webpack or RS pack enhanced module federation setup usually starts. You need already to augment your application because, well, you need your build process now to be aware of the shared dependencies and whatnot. In general, if you wouldn't want to share anything of these dependencies, so if you wouldn't want to share React and just embed something, you could also do that. But yeah, there is another advantage now, since we are already following this road of, let's say, using the module federation plugin here and declaring something like React as shared. Because if we are now in the respective component here, product page, where we want to use other fragments, let's say we want to use the basket info here, we could also teach already the build process that there are other so-called remotes, right? So we have a section in here where we can teach now the system what kind of micro frontends exist and how we want to name them in our setup. But here we get a little bit ahead of ourselves. And I'm always advocating against this approach here. And the reason is quite simple. If you do that, you already couple your system at this point in time at the build process. So you would already stick here to a certain URL, and that will be quite difficult to manage later on, right? Because you have now all these URLs, and if these URLs change, for instance, per environment, you would need one build per environment. Ideally, your build is quite independent of the environment. Now, if it is dependent, maybe it shouldn't actually depend then on these URLs of the micro frontends, because, I mean, yes, they might be environment dependent, but they might also be version dependent, meaning that they might change from today to tomorrow, and they might change without your application here changing, right? And therefore, you want to have these two things separated. But nevertheless, so we have module federation here, and module federation works fine if we use a bundler like RSPack or Webpack. There are other things like, for instance, for Vite, there is something like a plugin, but it's working only halfway. There are actually 3 plugins, one outdated, one not really working, and one more for Native Federation. But yeah, rest assured, they want to be more bundler agnostic. At the moment, I would say it's a half-half story. It's very half-baked. So if you go into module federation, try to keep on a single bundler system. So either Webpack, RSPack, or something else, like you can even go for Vite, but then stay within this ecosystem, because they all usually have some assumptions, unfortunately, at the moment. But the story is getting better. So let's not highlight this too much, because it's just maybe a little bit of an issue still today, but hopefully in the future, no longer. Okay, so now we build, let's say, our application. We are not yet sure how to integrate, let's say, but let's make the next step, and let's just go for one of these micro frontends. Now here we have actually 2, ideally, for the structure store, one called blue and one called green. What we could do is also, we could just make one micro frontend containing both of them, because at the end of the day, it won't really matter. We can, of course, also make singular ones. Let's maybe start with the approach of making a singular one, and let's maybe use the green one as an example. So what we could go for is we start with a package JSON, and of course we give it a name, and maybe just call it green. We should give it a version. Let's just make it 010. And finally, we need, of course, to define a build system. So at this point in time, we have, of course, several choices. We can go for Webpack or something based on Webpack. Or we can go for RSpec, for instance, or something like RSbuild, which sits on top of RSpec. So since I went for RSbuild already, it's quite, let's say, close to just say we use the same thing again, right? We can, of course, also say, let's just go directly for RSpec, but for simplicity, I would say, let's just copy over what we have in here, because this seems to work fine, right? And let's just bring it in. Now, what we should also bring in then, therefore, is a couple of scripts. We just use the same scripts, a couple of dependencies. Well, we don't necessarily need React DOM, but that depends also how we want to do the integration. If we just look at this thing here, I mean, there's no usage of React DOM so far, so we can also just ignore that for the moment. We don't want to render. Let's not have it in here. Let's not use it. Now, we can, of course, come along and say, hey, let's just reuse our RSbuild config. And this looks fine. We don't have an HTML template, so we will ignore this for the moment. The question is, do we have an app entry point right now? I mean, we don't really. We have something in here, but we don't have an entry point. We can just see if we might, let's say, not need it at all. Let's just ignore this for the moment. And let's give it maybe a different port. Let's give this the 8081 just for the moment. And also let's change the asset prefix. Finally, of course, the auto path is great. We should use this. The unique name, we give it green. So that should fit to our micro frontend. So far, so good. So we give it also here a name green. Shared React, that's great. We want to share that. But now there's a little bit more to it, right? Because this, what we have here, in the end, we want to consume it, right? So this should not be just an application that's standalone, but this is actually, let's say, a fragment of something, and we want to refer to it later. And for this, maybe we should get our type completion first. So maybe let's add a second terminal here. Let's go to our modfed mf green directory. Maybe let's try to npmi, and it seems that I didn't save here. So let's save, and let's try to install everything. Rest looks good. So let's wait. This can only take a couple of hours, but in the meantime, I can already go ahead here and start with the exposes section, where I essentially map what kind of, let's say, modules I want to have available for others to consume. So what we actually want to consume later on is this recommendations component. So I would say, okay, let's bring that in. And we find it locally in the source folder at recommendations. I think it should be just resolved correctly if I'm declaring it like this. And let's give this a second to dry it out. Plugin is good. I think the rest looks fine as well. So let's see if I made everything correctly or if something is still missing here. So as mentioned, this can take a while, but we have still time, at least a little bit, because 3 technologies and 1 hour to go. So therefore, we are just crossing the expressive mark of the third of the hour. But anyway, That's when you only, let's say, scaffold half of your project, because the other half, I mean, you still need to wait until NPM is done. I have a feeling NPM was much faster a couple of iterations ago. I don't know what they did that now has, let's say, a timeout internally, but yeah, sometimes we just need to wait. And it's always involved not with, let's say, let's call it simple packages, but rather with packages that resolve in the end to something native, and therefore resolve to native capabilities of the platform, like RSpec does. Okay, so finally we did that. Let's see if this already works, or if something is missing. So something seems to be missing. It says it can't find an entry module. Yeah, that is what we talked about, that potentially we still need an entry module. But I mean, we can also be rather simple here and just say, I don't know, maybe let's call it index.js, and let's have an empty module in here. It's not very realistic, but it should actually get us through this part. And at the end, we see it processed all the images, very nice. And also we get our exposed part of the recommendations module, which is also great. So in the end, what we have in here is our MF manifest JSON, which is awesome. And we even have a little bit more. So here the green one, this is a module federation, module federation entry module here. In this case for the green one. Okay, and we have our manifest also generated, which is great. So this is a complete manifest of module federation version 2, and we should be able to just use this. But let's do one thing after the other. Maybe let's start this first. Let's see if this also runs correctly. So it runs at 8081. I have the wrong browser here on my screen. And let's see. Of course, this thing is empty. But what we want to have is we want to see where our manifest sits. And we see it sits directly on the localhost 8081. So here we have this manifest. Now we have two options. So the first option is that we give it this manifest. So Module Federation understands usually this manifest, at least version 2 of Module Federation. Or the other thing is, and that's the more classic approach, so that's also compatible with version 1 if you want to, you give it just a remote entry. Now, this thing, it should also work. And as you can see, I just pasted this URL, and at the moment it's also working. Now, what can hit us here is, for instance, a course issue. So let's just see. We go back here, and what we now want to do is we want to teach RSpec, or in particular Module Federation, that there is a micro frontend out there. So what we could do is we could say, hey, regarding remotes, there is one, we can call it green, and this one sits here. All right, so we declare it that the one we are referring to as green is also called green as a container name in the script running here, right? So we can rename it also locally as well. And what this allows us to do is, if we did everything correctly, that we fill out this spot here, the recommendations. So our goal is to have just recommendations written like a component like this. Now, the only question is, I mean, if we look for it, where is it defined? How do we define it? And for this, what we can do is we just define it up here. We wrap it in a React Lazy that React knows this thing is loaded asynchronously, right? And then we use our asynchronous import, and we don't use it on anything local. We don't have anything local, but we use it on the recommendations module exposed from the green micro frontend. All right. Okay, so let's see if we did everything right and if the thing can load. And if so, we are happy. And we are good, it seems. So We now change here. Here nothing changes, so that's maybe the last thing we want to improve. At the moment, this component here is static. And what we actually want to do is that we hand over, I think, this SKU, but let's have a look at the definition first, what we expect. So we get in here an SKU, it's by default set to Porsche. And what we actually want is to make this reactive and to change it. And we actually change it to the SKU that's currently set, right? What we could do is we just set it to current.sku, because this way we are sure it's a valid entry and not just something. So let's see if we did everything correctly. And yeah, so now this thing is also changing. So you get the gist of it. Now, why is this rather simple, right? Because from the perspective of our source code in here, it's rather obvious what's happening, right? So this thing here, it could, of course, also be a local component, right? Like this, right? There's not much difference. There's now just this, let's call it magic string in here, which is then used inside our SPAC to work against the plugin definition of Native Federation. And this one already knows that green exists. We taught it about it in here, right? And so we can resolve it. And actually, it will then look up if this micro frontend has been already loaded using this entry point. And if yes, then it will actually work against the Native Federation API, which has an init. Maybe that was initialized already, and a get to get the respective component. So it calls get on recommendations, and that's the end of it, right? Personally, again, I wouldn't recommend this approach. Why? Because now you couple these two strongly, meaning that any change in the recommendations component, but specifically in the green microphone, will hit you hard. So I wouldn't, let's say, use this section in here. I would rather use a microphone discovery service, go against the microphone discovery service, get all the current microphones, and then maybe have a common API or a dynamic approach here, how to, let's say, resolve components. But this is things we talked about, for instance, last time when we introduced PK, which can also handle, of course, Native Federation imports. So where is Native Federation strong at? It's really strong at scenarios at what we've seen right here, right? Where you just want to grab a single thing in, you still want to share a part of the code, it will just work. And that will be the end of that story. Where is it really weak at? Well, I mean, if you want to scale really well, then in my opinion, you will still need to add a lot of things. So it only solves for you the story of having, let's say, mechanism to give you this outer shell API with the init and the get function. And of course, everything from a tooling perspective to have dependency sharing prepared. Now, it's not very good in that tooling agnostic section yet, but it gets better and better. And something that is, let's say, better from the get-go is Native Federation. Native Federation is the second thing we want to look at. Therefore, we switch gears here and let's see Native Federation app. I have installed Vite already, but I'm not sure if it will just work. Let's see what happens if I go there. Well, it just works, so I'm lucky, it seems. That's good. I don't get any errors here. Great. So it's the same application. I just really happened to copy over from the template folder. So there are no changes yet. The app and everything, it looks like in the template. So nothing changed in here. So what's the story with Native Federation? Native Federation tries to give you an escape hatch by using native capabilities in the browser. So instead of relying in the dependency section area on things that, let's say, came from Webpack to let's say have the different dependencies properly prepared and properly packaged up, Native Federation uses a so-called import map, which is a browser native mechanism to allow having a single identifier for module and being used across the board. So having something like React, for instance, used in different modules instead of each module then defining a specific path leading to React. So in a nutshell, Native Federation you can use even without any tooling, but of course it might be rather cumbersome. I've written articles about it. You can read them online. But what I now want to show you is that you could actually leverage what Native Federation gives you out of the box already, let's say, in a way that doesn't even involve any kind of tooling. And again, it all would start with having real ECMAScript modules, defining then, of course, also things like shared dependencies. So what you could do is you can have a script and you can give it a type of import map. So meaning that we don't know what we want yet here, but what we definitely want to use is an import map. And this one has a certain structure. It defines imports, and we could, for instance, teach it about an import for React. Now, we could say, hey, React, we compile somewhere, or we use a website like ESM.sh. So I like that a lot because I don't even need to think about it, and I get something like React already properly packaged up as an ESM. That sounds rather easy, but it is not. For React itself, it is easy, but there are other dependencies like React DOM, and they bring in, if you're not careful, things that rely on CommonJS primitives like require. Now, that will be a problem if you just naively, let's say, transpile or compile React DOM to ESM. But very fortunately for us, this website is rather cool. So all the things that are there usually work very well and work very well with even with React DOM, for instance. So this URL should also work, but let's try it out. You see, you get out the right things. It's leading to more modules, but that's all fine. We don't care. Right? Usually these things are also super well cached. So we don't care about that at this point in time too much. Right, cool. Okay, we brought that in. At this point in time, we don't see much here that, yeah, I don't know. There is something going on, but that's about it. So we could load it. We are fine. We don't need anything more. Now, again, let's do the green Micro Frontend. Let's maybe introduce a folder called source again, and let's throw in these things here. Now, there are multiple ways how we can deal with it. I would say let's try an approach where we rely on the easiest way to get this done. And for me, at least, the easiest way is to use ESBuild, which is a rather very lightweight bundler. But again, if you have something else, maybe let's also make it 010. If you have something else, then please go for it. Right, so now let's maybe have the dependencies first. So we just copy them from what we had beforehand. Don't really need changes in here. And then for the dev dependencies, we only have a single thing, just rely on ESBuild. We will maybe rely on a couple of other things, but that's the one thing after the other. Now, one thing that, of course, is not so nice with ESBuild, the dev experience is definitely lacking compared to something like Vite or RESTpack, a Webpack, etc. So it has a watch mode, etc., but it has no, let's say, deep integration to things like, of course, hot reload and so on. So, but here we don't care because maybe the only thing we care about at this point in time is just building, and then we can serve it just via a standard plain web server. But first, let's try to build it and have something, let's say, working before we continue, right? And now what I would say, we use a script, we just call it build.js, and this is everything we would need for making this work. All right, so let's go over and let's install the dependencies, and hopefully, yes, this works much faster now. So this is great, because now maybe we should even be more modern and use full ESM syntax in here. And I guess it should just work running like this. All right, so we can use build. Now the question is, what are we building? So we also have an entry point here. The entry point that we want to use is located in source, called recommendations.jsx. Then next thing we want to do is we want to determine the platform we are building for the browser. Next thing is we want to determine the format. This should be ESM, definitely. And this is really important. We want to tell it that React is actually an external. Do we need something more? I have a feeling I forgot something. Maybe we should define an out there. And let's say that goes to dist, but I guess that should be it for the moment. Let's have a try. So that didn't work. Cannot use external without bundle. Yeah, that's a good point. I thought I forgot something. So we should definitely set bundle to true. And we also need to set splitting to true in the long run. Maybe not right now, but yeah, we definitely want splitting also to be true. Now, a final thing is we don't have defined yet other formats, like, for instance, what's happening with these images. So we will potentially get in, or quite sure, we will get in trouble here, but let's just assert that for the moment. So here you can see no loader was configured. Let's configure that. And we want to say for a JPEG, we want to use, I think it's a file. Yeah, I think there should be a file. And I'm not sure if CSS is handled correctly out of the box. It seems to be the case, but I'm quite sure it's not handled very well. Because if we look at the output here, I mean, it's not minified, but that's not our problem at this point in time. We get back relative URLs here, which is quite nice. But these relative URLs, it will not be so useful. We will see in a second why. And the other thing is we don't see our CSS file in here, right? It's not remarked. So we need to take care of that on our own. Again, the dev experience is rather shallow, but yeah, you get the idea. Nevertheless, let's go ahead and define a start command. So we say when we start, we just want to serve the dist folder, and maybe we give it also port. We had the 8081 beforehand, so let's also go for the 8081. All right, so this all is there, is set up, and using this, we can just extend our dev dependencies with the HTTP server, and finally, we should be able to run it. So now this thing runs, but I mean, it doesn't run anywhere. So therefore, I mean, we can assert that our folder is there. We can assert that our file is here. But at this point in time, we don't have any means of showing it in the application. So let's change this. And let's go back to our application, our product page. And what we want to do is, like beforehand, to define a recommendations component using React Lazy and the import function. But this import function now has not to be the import function that's used by Vite. But what we want to do is we want actually to go against our remote script here that sits somewhere, right? So we can also place it maybe in here to fully indicate this is the case, right? Okay, so finally, let's get this down here. And let's try it out. And then let's see. So we got troubles, but what troubles do we have? So we have troubles with cores. Of course, we have troubles with cores. That was, by the way, handled before and automatically. We would also have had troubles beforehand, but the dev server and RS build automatically enables cores. So here we didn't do it, meaning, yeah, let's just restart and retry. So finally, we can display something, which is already good. This is great. It's always, again, the same thing. So we might want to have the same augmentation we had before. And so we use the SKU and we go to current SKU. And now we see that this thing changes. So this is all great, right? The question is, at this point in time, why aren't the images showing? Well, the images aren't showing because we have still these relative URLs. Looking at the URLs, they go to /reco whatever, and / is of course / on localhost 1234. But these images sit, of course, in our Micro Frontend. So what can we do? There are multiple ways to get out of this. There is an ES build plugin we could use, but there's also something else we could do. Since we are in an ESM anyway, in here, we have access to the full spectrum of ESM. So we have access to import meta URL. And this gives us the base URL, let's say. So now we have the base URL and we have these relative URLs in here, right? So maybe let's start with record 1 here. So what we can do is we can say, instead of just record 1, we do the following now. I will add a cursor to the line ends, and then I will just use get URL of record whatever. And this get URL just creates a new URL based on the path that's inserted. And it uses the base URL in order to, in the end, get me the href. Sounds good, right? So we're creating a new URL that uses now the base URL where our script lives, and makes this path, which is a relative path, now an absolute URL. And so we just return back the absolute URL. And this little helper is quite useful at this point in time, right? Now, so far so good. This is all great. So how can we try it out? Well, we build, we start, and we refresh. And voila, the images show up at this point in time, right? This is good. We don't get any trouble with the CSS, but rest assured, the CSS is not really there. We have a problem, and yeah. How could we solve that? I don't think the CSS is there. I think it's already part of the application, which is why we don't see it. Let's see. Record. Yeah, I mean, it already goes to say that the recommendation is somewhere. It doesn't define anything more, but where can we see it as well? There should be something, the image inline block 180, 180. So it's definitely not set to this, I think. Ah, it is. Inline. Inline. Content script. Okay, so somewhere we set this. Well. Let me check. Yeah, that's what I feared. So we have it defined already in here, which is not good in the style of the application. Otherwise, we would, of course, see that this style sheet is not loaded. I mean, we already saw it, right? So it's one of the things that's not there. So if there would be, let's say, any override in here, then we would have a problem, right? So the recommendation CSS is nowhere referenced in here, right? No result. It's not coming up. So what could we do? Let's first make this a little bit different. Let's make it 140 by 140. Let's make it an important. I don't want to get, let's say, in trouble with the other one. But yeah, of course, important we should only use as a last resort. And how can we now make sure that this style sheet is considered? Well, I mean, we can, of course, make it sure in here. So one thing we could do is we could just say, document head append child, and we call this style, and the style is document create element link, and the style rel is style sheet. Yeah, and the style.href should be get URL of recommendations CSS. And if we do that, that's a little bit of duplicate here, right? That's how it works. We couldn't import it like this, right? Then we also load the CSS in here. Okay, let's just give this another spin. And did it work? It doesn't look correct. So it must have failed somewhere. We should see it in here. So let's make this a little bit larger. Let's see. We get the recommendation CSS, but it tries to load on the wrong thing. It tries to load recommendations. Recommendation. Okay. So usually the problem sits in front of the screen. I mistyped that. And now it's smaller, right? And the style sheet is correctly loaded. Again, so you could automate that, and there are plugins for ESBuild, but you need to, let's say, have the overview and really scaffold everything on your own. Now, there is a plugin for Native Federation, which does something similar to what we've seen, but it also computes for you the import map and all that. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to what we've seen right now. So these things, it's just convenience, this tooling on top of it. And that is why Native Federation is so interesting. At the end, it just does this for you. And it's therefore really bundle agnostic, right? Because if you use the Native Federation official, let's say, tooling and runtime or not, it doesn't matter, because what comes out is essentially what you just wrote from scratch on our own. So therefore, when should you use Native Federation? It makes great sense for web applications that are really, let's say, running in current browsers, are really just really tiny and should be fully independent of any tooling, because there you can do it. You can even do it from hand. So you wouldn't have to use ESBuild, for instance. You could just do it from hand. The only reason I used ESBuild here is it transforms already the JSX syntax. But there would be no need for me to use ESBuild. You could just write it from scratch. It would also work, which is really great. Now, the only thing that Native Federation on top of it also defines, and what we didn't, but that's just because it's needed from the runtime, is a so-called manifest. So what it usually does is it would create something that it calls like remote entry.json, and this manifest file would actually define then what it is. So it would give it a name, right, like green, and then it would give the things it exposes, like for instance, this exposes recommendations, and it would tell it, of course, where the files sit for this, right? So all these things it would do, plus, of course, it would declare the shared dependencies. Yeah, to be determined, right? So this is what Native Federation does as well. But again, this file is only needed for the runtime, because this in the beginning gets in already in a very loosely coupled fashion. What Micro Frontend exists in form of the aggregate of all these different remote entry JSON files. It would go to all these remote entry JSON files, and therefore it would now know what thing it needs to load when you say, I want to have green / recommendations. But that's just to have the same mental model as Native Federation. Now we got a question from Patrick. Thanks. Would you recommend Native Federation for enterprise level applications? Well, I would say it depends, of course. In general, yes, because I mean, since it's really tooling agnostic, since it already builds upon ESM, you get already a great set to start with. Plus, of course, if you can go into the official tooling space, you got already, let's say, something to work on. You don't start as bare as we did here. Which is great, right? You get already these JSONs and everything is defined. And this, of course, gives you an experience that's very much like Native Federation. But there are, of course, some downsides. And that's why I've shown the, let's say, really agnostic way of not, let's say, using any of the provided tooling. Because if you use, for instance, the ES build integration that they have, in my opinion, it still has kind of some severe problems. Plus, the way it operates from the runtime, it always only works in a flat way. So you cannot define, and that's what you could before in a Native Federation. So the thinking model is also not 100% the same. You cannot include a remote that also relies on a remote. And the reason is simple, because if you don't see directly in your flat entry in the beginning what kind of remotes you have, you can't construct an import map reliably. Because if you need to extend the import map later, because now you detect there's a remote in a remote, right? And you need to load the remote of the remote, it's too late. You can only define the import map once. This is the reason that Native Federation, the original runtime, is not an ESM, but a standard file. So you don't need to have an import map defined beforehand. And so it will define it on initial load for you, but that only works, again, if you have a flat list of remotes. And that might not be the case for you. And since we only have 10 minutes left, that is where Piral, for instance, comes in, or also Picard would also work, what we looked at last month in the meetup. Picard can also do it. It does it with some tricks, but the out-of-the-box runtime of the, let's say, Native Federation modules or packages as they exist on NPM, they can't do it, unfortunately. So therefore, I would say if you have just this flat thing or a really simple setup, go for Native Federation. It's great. It's really simple. It's lightweight. You don't need to go into their tooling. If you find it buggy or whatever, you can always fall back to something as we've seen here, which is great because any bundler can produce ESM files. And so this is really great. And sharing, etc. It also works great. So this is all good. But now we come to the, of course, final story. In 10 minutes is not enough time, but let's just touch it really, really briefly. So we had Native Federation, great tooling for, let's say, getting the power of shared dependencies out there, for having just simple integrations. It's all working. If you need to have more on an enterprise level, you will end up writing your own framework, which is never a good thing, to be honest. Yeah, except, of course, in some cases. And otherwise, what you could also go for, which is a little bit more lightweight, where you don't need so much bundler support, but of course there is some if you need it, is Native Federation. It just builds upon ESMs. And so finally, we now look at a full framework called Piral. What we can do here is I will just now start a simple scaffold and hope it will not take too long. Let's see, make the app. And I will just call here npm init Piral instance. So this will now ask me a few questions. It starts with what's the root directory? It's the same. Let's use index.html. Let's base it on Piral. We also want to install things. Sure, let's use the 150. There's the current version is 161. We don't care. It's all good. TypeScript is fine. And boilerplate template default is good. You use npm, maybe that's a mistake, but let's see. And maybe as a bundler, we could go for something more exotic. Let's go for Vite here because it should just work. And then we try and scaffold everything. So what makes Piral different to the approaches beforehand? Well, it works essentially with all of these approaches. It doesn't care about what's the mechanism underneath. By default. So out of the box, if you don't do anything, then everything will be shared using system.js, which is really generic, meaning that, I mean, it just can resolve anything at runtime for you, which is quite great. And of course, it comes with two, let's say, primitives out of the box. It has the central sharing. So the thing where Native Federation struggled a bit, if you remember, we needed to have it asynchronous. This thing doesn't need to have it asynchronous, and it still is able to share all the things. So if you have something shared from your application, that's called a centrally shared dependency, and that's just shared, right? And then, of course, the micro frontends between themselves, they can still share other things as well, and that's called distributed sharing. So Native Federation out of the box makes everything distributed sharing, even if you start from the application itself, which is a good approach in my opinion. And here we distinguish, and we can have both. The advantage of having both is that one thing you can actually dictate, so to speak. So you make an architectural boundary to say, if you use this dependency, you use it in that version, by the way. Another thing you can leave free, and you can say, well, I mean, I don't care. If you want to use it and others want to use it, just make it a distributed dependency. And then the version of it is negotiated, and you get the version that well satisfies your specific constraints. Okay, installation takes a little bit of a while. Again, we've seen that beforehand, but while this is installing, we can take a look at the structure. So it now created a Piral JSON, it created a package JSON. There's much more in it than we need. And then we have, of course, our file in here, right? It doesn't look so different to this one. Maybe let's just copy over or change it a bit. We don't want to rely on this style sheet maybe here. I don't know. We need that. Let's just keep it like this. Yeah. All right. I'm not sure. I guess we also need to set this to type module, but let's just see and find out. So here we scaffold everything. The style, we may still want to change this, but on the other hand, we should change it in our layout. So this is now the first thing that we see will happen here. So we have our create instance, and now instead of being strongly coupled already from the beginning, what we've seen with Native Federation, we already decouple here via so-called feed. We don't need to go into details now into this, but later on, you would just set up a Micro Frontend discovery service and change the URL either here or change the mechanism how whatever you're calling is interpreted, right? So you could have a fixed JSON also, and you just return here promise that has the resolve JSON or whatever. So there are multiple ways to do it. All right, maybe we haven't finished copying over stuff. So let me copy over the images. Let me, maybe the product page, we can also just copy over. This is good. And then finally, we should, I mean, this we can remove, I guess. We don't need it anymore. We bring in our style sheet, the index TSX. This whole thing we don't need anymore. So this is all defined in here somewhat, but we got this layout file. And again, there are more things than we need. So maybe let's just cut out things that we don't really care about. So it has these menu items and whatnot. Well, the error, we leave that in here. There are much more things than we need. We don't need a dashboard container. We don't need this here. We don't need the menu container or menu item. We have no room for notifications right now. I think this is all good. Let's also remove this, remove that. Finally, I think the only thing we really care about at this point in time is maybe the product page. So maybe let's just introduce the product page. And so we also don't have any real routing in here going on. So we don't care about the children. It's quite great, actually. And we use just the product page import. Think like this. So something like that. Ideally, that already works, but let's just check it out before we are done. So we won't get everything done, but maybe we can get the gist of it in a second, right? So this seems to work. Let's see, this is correct. So everything is as beforehand. Now, what we created in here is our application. We could just ship it, but there's one thing that Piral also does for us. If we build it, it doesn't only build our artifacts, and these go into release, right? These are the artifacts we could publish somewhere, but it also builds us an emulator. There are multiple emulators out there. Let's actually use a different one here. So let's go to emulator, and let's say we want to use the website emulator. So let's run build again. And what we should now see is that the emulator is no longer a TGZ, which is just the npm package tarball, but is also a set of artifacts you could upload to a server. So what we can now do is just start the server at this emulator, and we started at 8080. And maybe I should use cores for it. Just to be sure, right? And now this thing already starts up this emulator as a website, and you still got this emulator JSON. And using the single file here, what we can now do is we can create micro frontends, like for instance our green one, right? Let's look into that. Make dir mf. And let's make also green. And now we can init a new pilot, right? And what we can say is that our source is actually coming from this emulator here. And we can, of course, also say other things like let's bundle using ESBuild or something else. We don't care. There are all kinds of bundlers. And otherwise, let's use the default things. So now it says it can't find it. That's not good. I think I might have a really old version of this thing. Let's make this the latest. And let's see if this works better. Otherwise, can't really show it. No. But let's see. Positive it was just because of the old version. But that's the main idea here, right? You create here a new micro frontend, and you create it already with the runtime where you want to run the micro frontend in. And the big advantage of this whole process, of course, is that you never just have to see the integration in the final step, but you can always see the integration, which is really nice. And always in isolation, but always, of course, also with the possibility of bringing more stuff whenever you need it. So I let that finish, and hopefully when it works, we can have a closer look at it. And I will just copy over then at the end of the day, I guess, the one from here, even though that's not ideal. Maybe the other one would be even better. Let's see. Yeah, maybe let's start with this one. But at the moment, it just takes a long time, and we're already a little bit over time, so I don't want to give it too long. But the main advantage here of using a full framework is that all these things, of course, already covered. Like it's already fully made for loose coupling. It's already fully made to be resilient. And it's already fully made to enable distributed development. So all these things that in the other approaches you would need to somewhat add in your own way, which means you would always end up creating, of course, your own framework, hence the advantage of a framework. Now, the other advantage, of course, is that finally this thing allows you to go ahead and just, do instead of discussing all the basics. And which is rather great. You have all these different paradigms, and you have them just at your fingertips. All right, so this now seems to have worked out. It already did some steps. It's now creating, let's say, a default setup here, but we already passed the app shell in there, so the emulator is fully set up. And if the npm installations would be fast, we could get more done, but as it is, unfortunately, it seems that things always take a little bit of a while to download, so sorry for that. Maybe I can already start copying over the things that would not conflict at all, like the images we can bring over. We will need them, and we will need those two files. So now we have them. We will get an index file here, but in here we will see it is a little bit easier to use. And as a final step, I mentioned we don't have strong coupling now. So the question is, how do we bring in something as recommendations, for instance? And the answer is a so-called extension slot. So what is that, an extension slot? It's just a way to define how something that you have a position somewhere where other things can be rendered in. So in here, we could say there's an extension slot, and the name we give it is recommendations, for instance. So we could say anything that brings in something with recommendations can live at this position. And now the only thing that's left is potentially some parameters to define. So we could, for instance, say, there's one parameter called SKU, and this is the current SKU that we bring in over. Now, having those two things, we are done essentially, right? So while this is still installing some stuff, what I would do is I would rebuild, but maybe only the emulator, and then I think we need the minus beforehand. And then we would just restart our emulator, which should be fine. So we always get the latest version there. We work locally against it. So this thing now, of course, also runs locally in port 8080, but it could run, let's say, somewhere on the internet. You don't care about that. And anytime you start your micro frontend or you build, it checks then are you online? Is the emulator there? And if the emulator is available and the emulator is more up to date than what you have locally, it will be updated, which is quite nice, right? So you can work on a plane and it would just work. You can work on a train or somewhere else where you don't have internet, it would just work. But of course, once something updated, once you're online, you just grab the latest update. And holy moly, these installations today, they take some time. It's quite frustrating. We want to move forward. But the good thing is we already made some progress. So I can remove this thing that came from the scaffolding, and I can just change this here and say I want to lazy load recommendations. This is good. I got my pilot API. I have not started that, but app seems to be fine. I don't need this. I don't need that. I don't need this. There's a lot of things I don't need. I don't want to register a page. But what I actually want is I want to register a so-called extension. And finally, we are there. Let's see. And this should be called recommendations. And whenever we are, let's say, displayed, we just want to display the recommendations, but we want to display them, of course, with the given parameter, right? So we just do that in a way that the recommendations are properly mapped. And now we get proper type completion, we get an error. So let's see. Okay, I think it should be fine now. Let's see if there's something and if that's working. And you see it's working out. We got our recommendation in here and everything is working as it should. So now that this thing defines it using Piral, you'll see the setup here. We register an extension, which registers now our component. And then our application gets it in the product page using this extension slot. That's all. So you already created the setup. Piral helped you, and Piral now makes it available to you. You can just publish it. You can manage your microphone discovery service, and everything works as it should. And with this and a little bit of delay today, I want to thank everyone. If you have more questions, always feel free to come in our Discord, ask questions there. And otherwise, see you in a month. There we will have a guest and we will talk a little bit more about Micro Frontends using Blazor and what you can do there. And in the meantime, I wish you all happy Thursday, a great time, and see you all next month. Bye.